Welcome to Circle Around. On this podcast, we hope to see, analyze, reflect, and respond better to our context by asking meaningful questions that lead to better questions. Our conversation is aimed at helping believers make sense of their world and then reimagine a new way of responding faithfully with full presence to the challenges of our urban society. We are your hosts, Lusanda and Mahlatse Mashua. Mahlatse, it's always a pleasure talking to you. For this episode, we're speaking about seeing place. We're talking about developing the courage to see our context better, right? So I wanted to start by reading this amazing quote by Leonard Hilmerson from his book, No Home Like Place. It says here, to return home is to return to a place. Through experience, human hearts become rooted in place. The paradox of place is that it is both given and socially constructed. Place is storied and so contested because stories themselves are placed, conditioned by history and culture. But place has become transparent to us. Like air, we are immersed in it and can't live without it, but we don't see it.
Sure. It's an amazing quote. It reminds us of our favorite quote, John 1:14.
Yeah.
And the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Speaking about, again, the concept of the incarnation, that it's such a profound concept because it's, in light of also the quote that you just read now, it's not just about a spiritual truth or a metaphor when we speak about how God came to be with us, right? That even other people like Eugene Peterson in his translation talks about Jesus moving into the neighborhood, right? But it's actually a literal thing that we're talking about, that Jesus literally was born in history in a particular place, right, and time, that he lived in a home. And if you can imagine the home that he's living in, it's filled with maybe some sawdust or some wood shavings from the work that his father as a carpenter did. Yeah. But there was a well. He lived in a town where there was a well where people gathered in the early morning and the late evenings, where he walked the dusty streets of his town, maybe went to the shore to watch the fishermen bring in the catch of the day. But it's speaking about a real place. And it's the beautiful truth that the invisible God came to be here, came to be with us in this world, that he lived, that he moved, that he acted in this world. So it's a beautiful thing to really wrap your head around. But as always, let me start by asking you two questions. The first one is, where have you seen this week, the place that reflects the pain of a broken world? And what places also have you seen God moving into the neighborhood?
Yeah, so speaking of the presence of God in our world, these two stories actually they feed right into that, my own presence in my own world. So they're actually about our kids. So on Saturday, I was on the phone and there was a story that I was following, and so I was very engrossed in it, and also, the thing in me that always wants to make sure that I'm properly tuned in and I'm aware of what's happening and I'm engaging. I was in like work mode, but I wasn't. It was a Saturday, so I'm busy scrolling through my phone and I'm following the story and I'm reading all the comments and Yeah. And then Maisha comes, you know how, when she wants your attention, she goes, Mama, Mama, Mama. Sometimes she'll turn your face so that you can be there with her and be present. Yeah. And I got really, really agitated. And then I had this outburst. And I'm like, Maisha, can you not see that I am working? Right? And then she said, Mama, it's Saturday. Yeah. And I wanted to play with you because I wanted to show you how bad. I wanted to show you that I am sorry for not listening to you earlier. Firstly, I was so convicted about the fact that I was. Yes, granted, the story was important, and it's important for me to be engaged as a citizen, as a decent citizen, to be aware of what's happening in my world. But I had prioritized presence out there versus this being present fully here in this story, because Maisha was also wanting to fill my love tank, with a relational breakdown earlier, where she wasn't listening to me.
Like that,
She's sweet, and so I was obviously confronted with this continual pull in terms of my presence and how my daughter was wanting to connect with me, but I wanted to rather connect with the story and in the cyber world and all of that, and I felt really, really moved by her desire to move towards me, but I didn't want to meet her there, and so and I was very confronted by my by not wanting to, by the fact that I didn't want to be present with her. The second question was, where do you see God making home in our world? Also with our children. On Sunday morning, I have this idea of how my Sunday mornings are supposed to go, right? But then this particular Sunday, you weren't feeling your usual, Sunday best, where then I decided I'm going to take the kids, be awesome, let you rest, take the kids, and we're going to go downstairs and start my day. But then it just went like from 0 to 180 kilometers an hour for the whole day. And I just felt really, really hurried and just haggard. And so by the time that it was like late afternoon, I was giving off signs and wonders, where I'm like feeling really, really grumpy, and I give you signs and then you wonder what's wrong. And I didn't want to tell you what was happening. And then you like, Luce, I can see something is not okay here. What happened? And then I felt, firstly, I felt guilty. Like, oh, know that you went well, and then I decided to do this. But then we had that moment where we found each other, and I had to name, that sense of being bothered by the fact that my Sunday got spoiled, and I never really felt the Sabbath that I was expecting. And then, you made right. You said you were sorry.
Usually that solves many things.
That solves many things. And but honestly, I feel like that for me, at least at a micro level, us finding each other is some of the ways that I see God wanting to make his home among us, when we know how to name things that put us at odds with each other within our family, and then we find each other, we reconcile, and the other person makes right, and to restore and bring back into that relationship.
I agree. I think sometimes that act of finding one another gives us the sense of hope of how things are meant to be, at least a restoration of relationship or connection. But thank you for being gracious in that moment.
You did make up for it. So
I did. I still am. But so talking about this idea of place, a home, and belonging.
Yeah.
I realize that for many people, they make that automatic assumption and connection that between home and place, that where you are, that's home.
Yeah.
And that usually home has these connotations of, this is where I belong, this is where I rest, this is where I'm wanted, this is a place of safety for me. But one of the things that really, I think, maybe showed the disconnect between these three things for many South Africans was during the lockdown period, right? And I had the privilege right early on, as the lockdown was announced in our country, to then kickstart the activities of the Kolisi Foundation, where we got to travel around the country and provide much needed food relief and support for families that we knew would be in trouble because of the lockdown, particularly in under-resourced communities. Now, one of the things that we began to notice as we traveled around different spaces in our country is the idea that where people were confined to this place that was meant to be home was a place of lack for many of them, was a place of despair and distress, but it wasn't the same thing for everyone. It depending on where you went, which space this sense of home was located in our country, different people had different experiences, and belonging wasn't necessarily always a common experience. And so that really hit me hard. I already knew about it, but that really hit me hard seeing that. And you stayed at home. We were with our girls who were, but stir crazy. They really, they really wanted to move. They wanted to get
When are
out.
we going out?
Every
When are we
hour,
gonna do this?
every
When are we
hour
gonna
they
have a
kept
play
on
date?
asking, yeah, exactly, when are we going to be able to do the things that we normally do? And and mostly you had to do, I think, containing them, if I
Yeah.
can put it that way.
Yeah.
And so the question would be, what has this time, this lockdown period for you, shaped the way you see place, home, and belonging?
Yeah. So again, going back to that quote, Hilmarsson says there that place is contested, right? Because it's something that's given and socially constructed. And there's something about the lockdown where you are all asked to stay at home, stay in your home, right? That showed, at least for me, that being in crisis mode actually helped me to see place properly and to see place for what it is. Firstly, for me to see my place for what it is. I remember that for the longest time, I would always be like, oh, I wish we could have more this. I wish I had more decor. I wish I could build a little bit of this. And, and I always, it almost feels like my home was never enough, right? Until, yeah, shame. You felt that. I felt like a flashback. Yeah. And I always felt like there were things that weren't good enough and all of that. And all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, I'm in a house where I take for granted that the structure is safe, that the community itself is safe. There are things that exist in my community that I don't even worry about. The things that are invisible in my community that make me feel like I can have a pretty decent lockdown here. And there are things that are visible in my community that give it the texture that actually I'm going to have quite a good lockdown. I have access to things. All of a sudden I was aware of the fact that we can get resources to make the lockdown better for our kids. They weren't going to go to school, so we could get them toys. If there's a wind or a flood or whatever, my house is going to be okay. So I saw the things that I took for granted, and then I became grateful, right? And then the other layer was that I was aware now of the tension that I felt that, wait a minute, so if I had this romantic notion of my lockdown experience, what's happening with everyone else? So then there's this tension of what I call suburb guilt, where actually being aware of your place and its ideal setup, now I'm aware that actually, as it's popularly said, we might all be in the storm together, but we're in different boats, right? And me then being in this space made me aware, like, wait a minute, we're not all in the same lockdown experience. There are people living in communities where there might not be access, right? First of all, the gogo who has to go and sell food for the day so that she can have money for tomorrow. That income is gone, and so many different work situations that were affected. And I was aware that actually, wait, South Africa is in different places, and there's something like you were saying with the foundation work. All of a sudden, all of the poverty and inequality that we've been happily kind of continuing with comes to the surface because of crisis. And then also the idea that I can take for granted my own safety as a woman, right? I'm in a home where I know that I'm not living with my abuser, right? There are people who before the lockdown, right? If they were living with an abuser, the abuser can take a break from their abuser. Maybe he goes out to play golf with the boys, or he goes out to for a night out in town, or maybe the guy gets to go to the tavern, or the person goes to work and they don't have to be. But now all of a sudden, because of the lockdown, women and children have to sit still and be in lockdown with somebody that's a perpetrator. There's no way out. And so I was just aware of those dynamics, and also finally just the sense that now, because we're all congregating in the digital space, because that's when we are being together, we're longing for connection, isn't it? And so we're connected on social media, and then you're constantly aware of what the rest of the world is experiencing, and then so you keep scrolling and you keep seeing the dire situations that other people are experiencing. So, and that also causes a sense of overwhelm. And so that's pretty much some of the things that made me see place.
Sure. And I mean, what do you think is at stake when we lose sight of place, when we don't understand just how space influences and speaks into how we experience life.
Yeah.
What is at stake when we lose that perspective?
Well, if place, I understand place to be encoded. Place is space with stories encoded on them, right? And those stories of those places, they tell you about the people that are there.
Right.
And so to be aware of the stories that are encoded in place also gives you an opportunity to see who people are, where they are, and also how the place has shaped them,
Yeah.
and how they also shape the place. And so I think we often kind of, experience Indao that we're in as if they're neutral, right?
Sure.
And so by the time that we talk about race, there's like something that brings up race and all these other socioeconomic realities that we experience. If we don't see the stories of places where those things are happening, we won't have an entry point into those conversations, because we're not building a reservoir of being faithful to the memories of the stories that the places have. And so then being aware of place means that we can see where race comes into the conversation. We can see where spatial inequality comes into the conversation. We can see where gender comes into the conversation, the economic landscape of places, right? We can see where citizenship comes into the conversation. Because now we know what happened then, so we can respond to these things based on the stories.
As you say that, coming from Bushbuck Ridge, there's a place just outside Matenteng, and I never thought about it because I think largely because it's also a translation, but it means a Matenteng is a tente from tent.
Yes, it's from
right.
tents,
So
yes.
many tents, and then I wondered, as you said that, I wonder what's the story behind that, because right next to Matenteng, there's not too far from it, there's another place called Enkanini. And Enkanini, I always thought that was maybe unique to Bushbuck Ridge until I left and traveled a bit, and I saw, wait, actually KZN, there's a place called Enkanini. In the Ekapa, there's a place called Enkanini. And if you look at the stories behind them, you realize that there's a common story. There's a piece of land that's unoccupied or unused, and certain people settle there, and somebody tries to remove them, and they resist that. And so the place, and then eventually they end up settling there, and the place actually then is called Enkanini, because I guess the translation will be the place of stubbornness.
Yes.
And then I asked myself, who gets to name places? Because
that.
I wonder if the people who live there would actually call it a place of stubbornness, or maybe they would prefer a place of resistance, or the place where we fought for our humanity, and won.
Our right to a home.
Correct, or something like that. But what I'm saying is, I think about also this idea of, that you're talking about, that place is really a space that encodes stories. And these stories are about people. And if you miss the stories of the place, then you miss maybe the people who occupy that particular place, and you miss their pain, the stories of pain, their victories, their identity, right? The things that speak about who they are. And it's interesting because in the scriptures, this idea of place, you realize that it's space is not incidental to God's activity, that God really cares about place. He pays particular attention to people where they are, and he is very deliberate about where he acts. I mean, you open the scriptures right in the beginning, the scriptures go to great lengths to tell us where, or to describe the landscape of the Garden of Eden, for instance. And we read about the rivers, and we read about the landscape, the geography of the place, the terrain, and so forth. But you move through, and then you see that God says, to Moses, look, go and meet me in such and such a place, stand in such and such a place, and then I'll cause my glory to pass in front of you. But you have to go in a particular place. You read about Jacob and his experience where he wrestles with God, and from that point he gets up and he makes this monument. But it's this place. This is where I wrestled with God, and right through in the New Testament, this continues. That understanding place, for instance, helps you to, and understanding the people, the stories of people in those places, unlocks much of our New Testament. Paul's letters, for instance, when you want to understand what was going on in Corinth, you think about Corinth as a city and the activities, the economic activities, the class system, the dynamics and how everything works. And you have to think through that. But also you see it in some of the gospel writers and how they even assume place is something that it has meaning, that they can use it as a literary device to tell us certain things. So, Jesus encountering the Syrophoenician woman, he leaves this particular area, Jewish territory, and how we're told he's left Jewish territory because he entered Tyre and Sidon, because now these are non-Jewish territories. And we understand that the way that's described, he's not there on a mission, say like Jonah to Nineveh, for instance. He's there to rest because the way place is described now becomes something that's assumed will tell us stuff about Jesus' own mission and his state of mind and what he's trying to accomplish, so that even that encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, long before we get to the dialogue, the way that the story is told and how place shapes the setting of the story, we already know how to then understand the interaction. I wonder, what has made us, or what makes us think that God doesn't care about place, you think?
Yeah, I think, I know that later on we're actually going to get into the way in which over time, church history and I think general world history has led to this place of dividing what's spiritual, which in terms of what God is concerned about, and what is secular and what's worldly, right? What we should distance ourselves from being too concerned about. But what really brings me a sense of reprieve when I look at John chapter 1 verse 14 is the fact that God didn't sit from this high and lofty place, but he saw something was happening in our place, and then he entered it, right? We talk about the incarnation as something that blesses, or rather, it's a visitation that shows us that God loves this creation that he made. Otherwise, he would have done some symbolic thing from afar and would have never really cared about entering into the physical world. And him being physical in particular places, like you were saying, the way he was, the way he moved through places, deciding to go through a particular town as opposed to going around it, had to do with his interactions with those particular people, and so on and so on. And so when I think about the importance of not being blind to the things that are happening in the physical world, it has to do with God wanting to make sure that we don't miss out on having a missional impact that is real, and developing the kind of resilience that says, my faith isn't going to thrive because I don't concern myself with the things of this world. Because there's something that's unbiblical about that, because then you have to wonder, why did Jesus come into this world? And Hilmerson says something in his book where he's talking about how we are not saved from history, but salvation is in history. That, like you were saying, that place isn't incidental. It's significant. And so Jesus, his arrival was a historical event, and so it should cause for us to lean into the story of history and say, how then do we develop a faithfulness to God if we don't also develop a strong lens that can look into the things that the world is experiencing and be courageous to face the summons to faithfulness firstly as a spiritual community, but also in the Christian tradition we speak about the Eucharist, right? It's a communion table, and what's significant about that is that it speaks about how our faith is a thing of embodiment. So not just a thing of knowledge of what we know, but how we embody it. And so it's about and this embodiment is becoming our words of faith and promise, right? And then it's how we act in the world based on those words of faith and promise. And I think when we are able to pay attention to this world and respond to this world with its challenges, with its histories, with all the things that are contested because of what has happened in a place, I feel that we get better at responding missionally. And so we don't have to rely only on our knowledge when it comes to responding to society's outcries and the things that happen on a daily. We actually keep asking ourselves, what has happened here? And how can I best respond? And I think that when we look at the person of Jesus, we have the template. But the bittersweet thing about the person of Jesus is that even this world that he came into, he died in this world, right? He experienced our brokenness, and yet also another thing that we see about Jesus is that there's resurrection. So in living an embodied faith, we kind of see this tension of like the fact that we know the stories of places is that it won't always be pleasant, but there's at least a promise that we will gain access to that resurrection life, and that we can actually facilitate whether it's seeing it or imagining it happen in this world.
I mean, that's really, really encouraging, Lucy, because to think about Christianity as a historical faith, to think about Christianity as historical faith, you're saying it's also to think about it as something that where space plays a significant role, because that historical event took place in space and time, a very specific space and time, and that also lends itself to how we understand our theological development, because we see then Jesus in his context, right? We see that these things unfolding in a particular space and time, but in the text, they come to us through the text. But at one point in time, then we see that has meaning for our hearts. So Jesus in our hearts, and he transforms our hearts. But he continues to act and move and live in his world to fix God's broken cosmos. And if we are to be disciples and followers, then we follow him in the world, and those are real spaces, and we can't then divorce the stories that are encoded in those spaces where people are located, in understanding fully the brokenness that resides, and also then appreciating God making home, or the shalom of God breaking through. Let me ask you, for somebody who's saying, look, this is a great concept, and maybe it's very philosophical, but bring it down now to this level. I want to understand this concept better, and in such a way that it allows me then to act, right? To be able to respond. What would you say, at least, is a good starting point for them? To follow, to develop this courage to understand this context of place, home, and belonging.
One of the things that encouraged me is a quote from one of my favorite authors, Emmanuel Katangole. Am I saying it right? Emmanuel Katangole.
I'm not an authority.
Okay,
on how to
no.
surname,
Okay,
right?
I remember. So he's a theologian from Uganda. In his book Sacrifice of Africa, he speaks about how the story, that stories that shape places are invisible. And the degree to which they remain invisible is a degree at which that they will keep on influencing people in those places. And so he says this to allude to the fact that the more that we make the stories of place visible, the more that we'll know this is why we get the same character in the story. And if you want to change a particular place and space, you have to get to the bottom story, like the story that haunts it, right? And so for me, things like getting to know your own neighborhood, the names of the streets, why is this called this? Who does the name of the street make an assumption that you will, that what does the name of the street say, and how does it create a sense of belonging in you? You said earlier about a place called Nganini. You know the type of person that would say, I belong to Nganini, right? places, think about the places that are named after struggle heroes, right? Who gets to name those places and what happened there, right? The fact that in town you have a street called Hanover Street, and then you have another community that is called Hanover Park. What happened there? What's the connection with those spaces? And then getting courageous to make the stories of our places visible, right? And I think when I even go back to that John 1:14, how Jesus he walked on this earth. There's something about the tactileness of God. There's something about the touchability of God, and I feel that touchability and that visibility of God in the pain of the broken world actually speaks to us and our willingness to be touched where there is pain, to be present where there is pain. That we're not trying to run away and say, I'm actually going to the sweet by and by, guys. Peace out. I don't talk about all of these hard stories. And so I think it's our willingness to be courageously there in the stories of pain that we find. And so that's honestly been my journey.
What's the end goal? I mean, I understand the street names, I understand the stories, that I would understand how my neighborhood or my community is organized, who lives here and why, who doesn't live here and why, who belongs here and who doesn't belong, that sort of thing. But what's the end goal in this understanding?
I think the end goal for me is always is firstly to allow the Holy Spirit to see the context where I'm living better, so that I can serve it better. There's a story in Exodus. I always used to find this very strange, where the women of Egypt, right, have just experienced this hectic, these plagues because of the deliverance of the slave community, right? And then what did they do? They lived in the direction of the people that were being liberated. And so they gave them, and I wondered about them, like, why did they give them their jewels? Were they saying, just take everything, you've already taken everything, or what was it? And I wondered if this isn't something about seeing who God is liberating and who God wants to liberate, and living your life in the direction of those who are marginalized and those who are on the other side of the flourishing story. And so yes, first of all, it's to allow the Holy Spirit to keep helping me see where the places of pain are and how to live in the direction of those places of pain and being courageously there. And secondly, also, it's because we want to know how to ask better questions and how to become more faithful to responding to places and what has happened there. Yeah.
Sure. Just to circle around, you started the story with, Maisha, his interaction with you, that showed something that we often, struggle with ourselves, which is the sense of being hurried. Yeah. The way that the book Soul Keeping speaks about being hurried is that you lose, you're always preoccupied, right, with the next thing or what I need to do, that you lose the ability to be present with God and with you. Yeah. And in a particular space, and I think the question that I ask myself is, how am I going to live intentionally this coming week, so that I protect myself against this preoccupation with the next thing, and all the stuff that I need to get to next, so that I really have I prioritize being present in the spaces where I find myself with you, with my children, with other people, with God, when I need to. And coming back now to what you said about the fact that people have a context, and space is a context, is to understand people, because it encodes the stories of people. And you said that space shapes powerfully the experience of people, how people experience life. And the reality is that a lot of people are experiencing their spaces in a dehumanizing way, right? That where they feel dehumanized, where they feel brutalized, where they feel oppressed. And so being able to see those spaces and to see those people then allows me, right, to participate with God and how I can live my faith in the direction not only of God, but in the direction of God, in the direction of people as well, where then I can participate with God in removing some, or at least playing a role in removing some of those things that are dehumanizing people, or that changes the way that people are experiencing their space. And so that's a challenge, is how am I going to see place moving forward?
Yeah. Thank you so much for sitting and coming full circle with us. Our conversation and growth as people of faith is ongoing, and so we'd love to keep journeying with you. Our circle around family, seeing how we can keep our cycle of faith, action, and reflection continuing. So follow our Instagram accounts and join us next week as we continue circling around.